a really good job of explaining what is yeast, why it's so important in our baking, what's it do, you know, how do we understand if it's working or not. But in general, it's a single cell organism. So funny because it's alive, right? It needs food and warmth and moisture to thrive. And the carbon dioxide that the yeast is involved with makes baked goods rise. That's why it's so important to get that rise from the yeast, right? So without further ado, I'm going to show you what I call the monster video here, because it shows you using, it's a little bit kid friendly, you could say, but it actually is a really good explanation. So let's just listen.
Understanding how bread's ingredients work is the stress of baking. The most unfamiliar ingredient you'll see in any bread recipe is yeast. Yeast is a living single-celled organism that causes dough to rise. Dough must rise in order to have the fluffy quality people expect in bread. Here's how yeast works. Any recipe that calls for a packet of dry alpha yeast will also include about a tablespoon of sugar and warm water. Every packet of yeast contains hundreds of billions of living yeast cells that have to be activated. Think of it as billions of teeny tiny sleeping monsters. You wake up these monsters by throwing them into warm water. Water can't be too cold or it won't wake them up, but it can't be too hot, you'll boil them to death. Once you wake up the yeast, the tiny monsters start gobbling up that spoonful of sugar. When they eat the sugar, they burn up carbon dioxide, CO2. This process is called fermentation. Take a look at the yeast now. You see all that foam? What you're seeing is the CO2. After I wake up the yeast, I add in the binding ingredients: oil, sugar, and eggs. These ingredients help keep everything together and add flavor. Now it's time to add in the flour. Pay attention to what happens as I stir. Did you notice how the mixture transformed from a liquid to a thick dough? This transformation was caused by a chemical reaction that occurs when flour mixes with water. The proteins in the flour begin to form into gluten. If you were to zoom in on gluten, it would look like thin, loosely woven threads. What happens when you weave gluten threads more tightly together? They become stronger and less penetrable. This process of weaving gluten is called kneading. Kneading is a crucial step in getting the dough ready for the oven. You knead by twisting, stretching, pulling, and pounding the dough. But why is it so important for the gluten to be strong and impenetrable? Remember the CO2 being excreted by the little yeast monsters? Gluten traps that CO2. So the stronger the gluten is, the better it will be at trapping it. If you only spent 5 minutes kneading your dough, it wouldn't be able to rise as high. After you're done kneading, it's time to put the dough in a warm place to keep those hungry yeast monsters awake. Your dough doesn't move, but there's a lot happening inside of it. The yeast continues to eat sugar and release CO2 that becomes trapped by your strongly woven gluten. After about 2 hours, your dough will double in size, ready to be shaped and placed in the oven. There you have it. Now that you know how yeast works, baking bread isn't so scary, is it?
Right. Just a little scientific background there to what yeast is all about. You don't really have to remember all those details to make a successful loaf happen, but it's kind of nice to see what, what the root cause is of all this. So with that, there's different types of yeasts as well. There's fresh yeast, which comes in more of a cake style. It's also called a wet cake, or a cake, and it's wet. And it's compressed yeast. It comes from, it's made from fresh yeast cells. That does not last long. However, you really have to have usually maybe it's a bakery that will have it because they have high turnover. They use a lot of yeast, so it doesn't expire, but it's only a couple of weeks in the fridge. Maybe it's not a very cost efficient way to have yeast unless you use a lot of it frequently. And there's your good old active dry yeast and instant yeast. That's what we see in the stores mostly. That's what you can use for all your yeast goods that you make. The instant is just smaller granules, so it does activate quicker. You can use either one. It just would take longer if you use just the regular active dry yeast, but they're essentially the same thing. Okay. And then there's your other kind of yeast you see out there, nutritional yeast. Those are for baking. This is just for nutritional advantages. Brewer's yeast is something you can get from some breweries. Sometimes they'll have yeast they use that I believe they also use for nutritional reasons. So it's more of a supplement. Has anybody had nutritional yeast before or use it in any way? Yeah, I haven't. Okay. I only bake with yeast. Okay. All right. So how do you buy your yeast? Well, remember that time, I think I had this slide specifically for when we couldn't find yeast anywhere. So it was really hard. But sometimes you can even get them from your baker, your bakery. Our local bakery was selling yeast when we couldn't find yeast out there. But nowadays it is back in the stores for the most part. You can buy them online. I do like packets. I decided I used to get the jars and the vacuum sealed yeast. The vacuum sealed yeast packages you'll find are this brick shape, and they're such a mess that they're more economical when per ounce. It's cheaper, but it was so messy, and I wasted so much yeast trying to manage that packet. I just went back to jars, and the jars I just didn't feel like they were always going to be as fresh. So because my rise would start to decrease as time went on with those jars. So then I went back to packets, which are your least cost-effective way, honestly, to buy yeast. But yeast in general isn't too expensive. Maybe a packet of 3 is a couple dollars now. And overall, when you make your own bread, you save so much money that I don't mind paying a little extra for the convenience of the actual packets of yeast. And that is another reason why I wanted to talk about how to use yeast today, because prices are getting so expensive for everything. And loaves of bread, I keep telling the story of my dad going to get the honey loaf that he gets at the grocery store, and it's now $8.89 because it's not one of your major processed brands. It's a little better quality, but it got to $8.89. I said, Dad, just tell me the ingredients and I'll figure out a loaf I can make that's similar enough, because I can't stand it. I can't let you spend $8.89 on a loaf if I can make something that is somewhat compatible or